It's good that you get to know it. Yeah, exciting.
Thinking back.
By Yale investment. I'm a teacher. And I run the center.
That happens to relate to environmental growth. Cool.
And Lindsay. We actually have never met, but I work with the Office of Sustainability.
For someone else.
For you.
Oh, okay.
These are all
He's
speaking
on
The
screen.
digital guy?
There's some kind of a digital screen. We do a lot.
Nice to meet you.
Okay, fellow sponsors.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Pick you up from that.
You're great.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. We have lots of friends that I'm sure will come in as they finish up their sandwiches and join us. So my pleasure to introduce Tony. Tony is a remarkable human being. You've probably seen all the kind of data and work and other elements that he puts together with a group of folks. Like any public opinion work that you probably see on climate has some root or connection or element to Tony's work. The thing that I think, as a colleague and someone who really leans on Tony and just learns from him all the time, is he's equally comfortable on the Colbert Report as he is sitting down with any staff member in Yale and talking about climate change. So you'll see Tony just grab lunch at a table and talk to people about his work in and around this place, and then he'll get on a show that's watched by millions of people and just make the people feel equally comfortable and engaged in the topic. He's got that kind of gift across people and sectors and areas. He's willingly shared that, and he's been a real voice, consistent, fierce, and scientifically rigorous for such a long period of time. It's hard to speak to the full impact of the way that Tony's ripple effects have gone across the world and the way people depend on and look at his data and insight and scientific research. So we're really jazzed that he's here today. Thank him for his time, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Stuart. That's a very kind introduction. Let me quickly introduce myself and what I'm doing. Please come on in. There's still a few seats over here for those that are just now percolating in. So yes, my name is Anthony Leiserowitz. I'm a faculty member here at the Yale School of the Environment, where I direct the Yale program on climate change communication. As a quick introduction, we do two broad things. One is we conduct research, basically trying to understand how do societies around the world respond to climate change. What do people understand and misunderstand about the causes, the consequences, and solutions to climate change? How do they perceive the risks, so the likelihood and severity of different types of impacts? What kinds of policies do people support or oppose? And what kinds of behaviors are people engaged in or willing to adopt as part of climate change? And that's something I'll talk a bit more about today. Ultimately, though, we are scientists, so our real question is why? What are the underlying psychological, cultural, political reasons why some people get really engaged with this issue Others are kind of apathetic, and some are downright dismissive and hostile, or at least they are in the United States. We work at many different scales, many studies here at the national level in the U.S., lots of state and local level work, and I'm mostly going to focus on that here. But to know that we also do a lot of international work as well. That includes, let me actually just get this going. That includes first ever studies in China and India, Brazil. We partnered with the governments of Ireland, Costa Rica. We've done studies with Meta at about 192 countries and territories around the world. So I'm not going to really talk about the global scale, but if people have questions about that level, by all means in the Q&A, let's talk about that. Let's see. Okay, text. There we go. There we go. The other thing we do is we do a lot of public outreach and engagement based on the insights that we learn. So we have a partnership program that works with governments, with companies, with advocacy organizations, with educators around the world to really help them be much more effective in their own efforts to communicate with their constituents, with their customers, with their members, et cetera. And then we also have a climate news service that we started about a decade ago called Yale Climate Connections. We have reporters all over the country that do online articles. We are just about to start a brand new YouTube channel devoted to climate change and extreme weather. And for the past 9 years, we've been running a national radio program where we broadcast a very short minute-and-a-half program every single day, brand new story, that plays on over 700 stations across the country. And if you want to see how we try to implement our insights in action, I'd encourage you to go check that out, because that's very much a reflection of what we've learned from the research. But today I'm going to really try to address two big questions. First, what is the role of the public and consumers in climate action? And second, how are consumers in the United States thinking about and feeling about climate change? So let's start with that first question. What is the role of the public and consumers in climate action? So first of all, this question is much bigger than public opinion, okay, which many people think of as just a measure of public support for government policies. And that is, of course, important, but that's not really what I'm talking about here. This is really about all of the climate-related decisions and behaviors of 8 billion people worldwide. So Abraham Lincoln once very famously said, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. So what does that mean in the context of climate change? How does public sentiment, or more broadly, public knowledge, decisions, and behavior affect climate change? Well, many of you may know this is a chart from Project Drawdown, kind of looking at, in the American context, the major components of the problem. And really, the answer is pretty much everything we do as human beings affects the global climate. Although critically, there are enormous differences in the carbon footprints of different people within and across nations, which raise critical questions of equity, fairness, and justice. But at the global scale, humanity needs to make a rapid transition, essentially from a 19th century form of energy where we still dig stuff out of the ground, coal, oil, and gas, and set it on fire to power our economies, to a 21st century energy system where we harness the energy from the sun, from the wind, from the tides, from the heat beneath our feet, and so on. So first, how do we use, waste, or conserve energy at home and on the road, especially those of us in the developed world? So just consider the transportation choices that billions of people make every single day, using motorcycles, cars, trucks, trains, buses, ships, airplanes. All of these transportation choices and systems are still predominantly driven by the burning of fossil fuels. Yet in the next decade, hundreds of millions of consumers worldwide will need to choose to replace their petrol-burning automobiles with electric vehicles, or choose lifestyles that don't require an automobile at all. Will people choose and use more climate-friendly transportation? Second is just straight-on consumer behavior, because everything we buy, from products like computers and cell phones, furniture, clothing, and toothpaste, to services like healthcare, banking, and insurance, are all produced by value chains still reliant on fossil fuels. Will billions of consumers choose to buy the products and services that are better for the climate? What kinds of homes and buildings will we choose to buy, retrofit, and live in? Single-family homes? Apartments? Skyscrapers? How will they be designed? Will we choose to live in urban, suburban, or rural areas? All of these decisions will have enormous consequences for the climate. What kinds of food will we grow and eat? Food and agriculture are major sources of carbon pollution. For example, will we continue to buy and eat more beef, the production of which currently generates substantial carbon pollution, or instead choose more plant-rich diets? Our collective food choices and behaviors already have enormous impacts on the climate, as well as, of course, our own health, our landscapes, and other species. How will we power our lives? For example, the world basically needs to electrify everything. Our vehicles and our buildings, including the ways we heat and cool our homes, cook our food, wash our clothes, and heat water, just to name a few daily activities. This will require critical but infrequent purchase decisions, like replacing a gas-fired furnace with a heat pump, to everyday decisions in the home. How can we empower consumers to make these more sustainable energy choices? Third is, of course, our social behavior. First of all is communication. Do we talk about climate change with our friends, our family members? Do we hear about it in the media and from our leaders? Talk is not a substitute for action, but it's a necessary condition for action. If we don't talk about climate change, then for most people the issue is out of sight and out of mind, and certainly doesn't seem like an important issue, let alone an urgent one. And this also includes the incredibly important role of what we call social norms. A good friend and colleague over at the School of the Environment, Ken Gillingham, has done a really cool study where he finds that as soon as one household in a neighborhood puts solar panels on their roof, it increases the odds that another household in that same neighborhood puts solar panels on their roof. And as soon as that one puts solar panels on their roof, it increases the odds yet again that somebody else puts solar panels on their roof. That's often not because neighbors are talking to each other, but because it's social proof. It's social signaling that somebody pretty much like me, same socio-demographic background, has said, I'm going to adopt that new technology. Maybe I should consider it too. Okay? Social norms. We, as Aristotle said, we are social animals. We take enormous information and cues from what other people around us are doing and saying. And in fact, we all experience this when you go to the grocery store. Okay? If you've been through a checkout line, you ever looked at to see what the person ahead of you or behind you is buying? Okay? Yes, of course you do. Okay? You're not having conversations about it, but you're looking. And they're looking at what you're buying. So even though you're not talking, you're communicating through your behavior. Fourth is political behavior. Will the public support or oppose government policies to address climate change? Will they support a higher price on carbon, which would then affect consumer costs? What policies are politically feasible? That includes, of course, voting behavior. Will citizens prefer candidates that are climate champions and vote out of office those that are blocking progress? Public participation in community planning and decision making. What kinds of communities do we actually want to live in? How can we participate in the design and implementation of those plans? And increasingly important, how can we protect our communities from ever more severe climate impacts? Because this is not future anymore. This is right here, right now. And then what I think is particularly important is advocacy behavior. Will we not just support climate action, but demand it from our policymakers and company leaders? We like to say we are not suffering from a supply of solutions, but we are suffering from a lack of demand for those solutions from both the public and consumers and policymakers. So all of these human decisions, all of these consumer choices, all of these behaviors will collectively determine the fate of the planet. That's why we care what the public thinks, what the public feels, and what the public does about climate change. Public sentiment shapes the social, cultural, and political climate of climate change, either enabling or constraining climate action. So now let's turn to the second big question, and that is how is the American public and consumers thinking and feeling about climate change? So just to set this up, here I'm really going to turn to some of our research. Let me just start by saying that it would be great and it would be wonderful if everyone in the United States, all 300 plus million of us, and frankly all 8 billion people on the planet, could have the equivalent of Climate Change 101. Okay? A full semester course, preferably taught at Yale, but we let some other universities. Really, here's how the climate system works. Here's what the causes are, the consequences, and solutions. Okay? That would be fantastic. The truth is, that's never going to happen. Not with 300 million people, not with 8 billion. Most people don't have the background, they don't have the training, they don't have the interest, they don't have the time to really dig in and truly understand the details of this issue. Okay? Most people are always going to have a very limited amount of shelf space in their brain devoted to climate change or, frankly, any other important issue. So the real question isn't, geez, I wish everybody understood all the details. It's like, what are the core things that you want them to know as a baseline? Now, of course, if you're a water resource manager and you're making those kinds of decisions, you need much more elaborate knowledge. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the general public. I'm also not suggesting that there aren't, in fact, millions of people who do want those details. And it is incumbent upon those of us in the expert community to go more than halfway to meet those people where they are and to help answer the questions as best we can. There is definitely an audience out there. But again, that's not most people. So what's most important for most people to understand as a base? Is it critical that they understand how the carbon cycle works? Probably not. Is it critical that they understand exactly how many parts per million of CO2 there is in the atmosphere at any given moment? Probably not. Okay. And in the course of our work and some of our colleagues around the country and increasingly around the world, we think we've identified at least 5 basic key facts that we think everybody ought to understand. Moreover, we boil those 5 key ideas down to just 10 words. But a friend of mine in Congress likes to do haiku on the side, so I'm going to give you her 11-word version. Okay? And here we go. Scientists agree. It's real. It's us. It's bad. But there's hope.
Nice.
Now that's simple. And in fact, that's one of its great strengths, is that it's really simple. Because part of communication is if I tell it to you, and then you tell it to you, and you tell it to him, and so on, does it translate? Right? Or does anybody remember mimeographs? Like things got really wonky fast.
Yeah.
Okay? Or the game of telephone. Like we all know that game, how quickly messages can get confusing. That's ultimately what you want, is something that's simple and clear that people can't really mess up. But these are deceptively simple. Each one of these is what I would call a meta idea. Each one can be instantiated, described, storified, etc., through dozens, hundreds, thousands of examples. Here are all the ways that we know climate change is actually happening right here, right now. Okay? Here's how we know that it's us. Okay? Yes, of course, the climate has changed over millions, even billions of years of Earth history. This time is different. It's the direct result of human activities. Okay? It's not volcanoes, it's not the sun, etc., etc. Here are the thousands of ways that climate change is bad right now and going to get much worse if we continue on the current path. And then this last one, but not the least, is that there's hope. And I'll just go academic for a second. In broad strokes, in this very crude statement, we think there are at least 2 fundamental things that people need to have in their mind about climate change. One is an accurate perception and understanding of the risks. It's what we call the field of risk perception. You need to know that you have a problem. But you also need to know what the solutions are. Okay, and it's what we call efficacy, which basically is a wonky way of saying that you know that there are solutions, that you have the ability to, or we have the ability to perform those solutions, and most importantly, that if you do them, it will make a difference. If people don't have that sense of efficacy along with the problem, then their tendency is to say, oh my God, way too big, I can't handle it, I can't do anything about it, so let me focus on the few things I can control in my life. Okay. So it's really important in the minds of any audience that they understand both what's really at risk, but also what we can do about it. Okay, so with this framework in mind, let's just take a quick look at how Americans are doing. And so here I'm drawing on a study we call Climate Change in the American Mind. This is data from now over 15 years worth of surveys. We do 2 of these a year, every spring, every fall, every spring, every fall, basically seeing how this changes over time. And what you can immediately see is that when we started way back in, does it work? Oh, there it is. Wonky. That's not helpful. Okay, back when we started in 2008, on the left side of your screen, we were at kind of a high water mark where 71% of Americans understood that global warming was happening. That was then followed by a 14 percentage point drop, massive drop, okay, which all other surveyors found as well. If people want to ask about that, ask afterwards. But since then, we've been slowly working our way back up until most recently, and we're about to release a new report. This is actually up even a little bit higher as of just a month ago. Basically back to where we were 15 years ago. Okay, so yay, America, we're at near our all-time high. Yay, congratulations. But just to put that in a little context, if we were in Japan, this number would be over 95%. Okay. So we still have a ways to go with a number of people, about 16% who say no, it's not happening, and then another roughly 18% who say they don't know. Okay, how are we doing about understanding that it's mostly human caused? Well, again, you can see back in 2008, we were at kind of a high water mark. Again, big drop again. Since then, working its way back up, but it's lower than it is on the happening question. So there's a number of people, and you can see it right there with the 27% in that black line on the far right, who think that it's natural. So they accept that climate change is real, but it's natural. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding, because if it's natural, then you might take it seriously as in the impacts, like we should be prepared for droughts and heat waves and so on. But they don't understand that it's the burning of fossil fuels and land use change is causing this problem. And thus, we need to be taking action to make that transition from fossil fuel energy to clean energy, for example. Okay? So that is still a fundamental communication need, education need in the country. I won't go into this at great length, but this is something we've studied a lot because we found this is what we call a gateway belief, that people know they're not experts. We all know we're not experts. I would say if I did a poll of you, most of you would say you're not an expert on how your car works, right? Or how your teeth work, or how your body works. That's why you go to experts to help you when those things break down, okay? And most people have actually enormous trust for scientists, especially climate scientists. Okay? Despite all the misinformation and politicization and so on in our country, most people actually really do trust the experts. So it's really important when they misperceive the consensus among those experts. Okay? Only 1 in 5 Americans knows that the scientific consensus, and there have been multiple studies over many years using different techniques that all converge on the same basic answer, that 97 to now 99% of climate scientists are convinced of just 2 things. It's happening, and it's human caused. Okay? Not what's going to happen to the Indian monsoon in the year 2080. Okay, there's a lot of uncertainty about that. But is it real, and is it human caused? There is no legitimate scientific debate about that. And yet only 1 in 5 Americans knows that. Okay? And because we're not experts, and because we perceive that there's still a lot of argument, many people adopt what we call a wait-and-see attitude. They're basically saying, hey, scientists, go off in a room somewhere, haggle this out, and if it's a serious problem, you'll come tell us, right? Not realizing, of course, that scientists did that literally decades ago. Okay? And this is not an accident. So 3 main things underlying that. 1, scientists. We're not good communicators. Okay? And moreover, it's not our day job. So we're not trained. Most of us are pretty crappy at it. It's not our day job. Okay? And yet, scientists could do better. The media played a big role in this, especially a decade ago, where there was a lot of false balance. Here's somebody who thinks climate change is serious, and we'll have an esteemed climate scientist who didn't comb his hair or brush his teeth that day on up against a paid industry hack who's good, like really professional. And so the person at home says that and says, oh gosh, it looks like it's 50-50. Yeah. But the other that we just have to say is that the real component here is that this is the core strategy of the climate disinformation campaign that's been fueled literally by the fossil fuel industry and its allies. This is in their files, and it's the exact same strategy the tobacco industry used. They borrowed that same strategy, which the tobacco industry did back in the 50s. Doubt is our product. We don't have to convince Americans that smoking is good for you. We just need to convince them that the science is unsettled. We're still figuring it out. And in that condition of uncertainty, consumers would keep smoking. And they did. And the tobacco companies raked billions of extra dollars into their coffers over those decades because of that communication strategy. That exact same strategy was lifted root and branch out of the tobacco wars straight into the climate debate. including by some of the exact same scientists who were saying smoking's not bad for you, who then argued global warming is not happening, or it's not human caused, it's not a serious problem, it'll bankrupt our economy, or it's actually good, like we want global warming. Okay? Who doesn't like warming? Okay? A whole raft of arguments. So there's a lot behind this particular finding. And what we also consistently see is that while worry, which really stands in for a lot of risk perception measures, has increased over the years, and that's something important, we still find that only about a quarter of Americans are very worried about this issue. Okay? And that's for a variety of reasons, but one of the most important is that many Americans still think of climate change as a distant problem. Distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, and distant in space. This is about polar bears, or some developing countries, but not the United States, not my state, not my community, not my friends, not my family, not me. And as a result, it's kind of psychologically distant. It just becomes one of 100 issues that's out there. Yeah, I kind of wish somebody would do something about it. But I don't see why this is important. I don't see why this is urgent. And I don't hear anybody else talking about it, so it can't be that important. And to that exact point, relatively few Americans hear about global warming even once a week. Okay, 33%, and this is all-time high, so this is good news. 33% of Americans say they hear about it at least once a week. And once a week is not often. I just ask you to think back over the past year and how many stories you've heard about the royal family. Okay? Climate change gets nothing like that. In fact, the latest estimate I just saw is that globally it gets about 0.5% of total news coverage. Mentions climate change. Okay? And likewise, relatively few Americans say that they hear people around them talking about climate change. And if, again, we don't talk about it, then how important is this? So let's come to companies, though, what we're gathered here for. And there's a lot on this slide, but the basic takeaway is we were asking people, do you think that each of the following industries should be doing more or less to address global warming? And what we find is that a majority, clear majority, says that's the case for every single industry we ask about. Especially the fossil fuel companies, so like Exxon and Shell, what is that, almost 71% say they should be doing more on this issue. But same with airlines, auto companies, trucking companies, tech companies, online retailers, food, agriculture, and livestock companies, restaurant chains, real estate, commercial real estate, renewable energy, clothing companies, advertising, and PR companies. You get the point. Okay? In broad strokes, when people ask who should be leading on this issue, they point to corporations first. And they point to themselves second. They point to government third, substantially third. Which is really interesting in an international context because it's just the opposite in China. Governments first, companies second, citizens third. Okay. So anyway, at least broad strokes, people are wanting more action from the private sector. And a majority of Americans support companies taking a variety of climate-friendly actions. Companies should stop advertising their products and services on television networks that spread misinformation about climate change. Yes, I'm looking at you, Fox News. Companies should purchase 100% clean renewable energy to power their operations. Yeah, people like that. Companies shouldn't make campaign contributions to political candidates who oppose action to reduce global warming. Car companies should do more to encourage people to buy electric vehicles instead of gas or diesel powered vehicles. Okay? So they may not know a lot, but their values, their underlying attitudes are absolutely, basically behind greater and greater action, especially by the private sector. Okay, so one other thing I want to quickly introduce you to, and Stuart asked me to emphasize innovation. So not only is that data series and that Climate Change in the American Mind project an innovation, we also came up with this innovation here called the Yale Climate Opinion Map, because I kept getting asked, hey, this is great national data, I'm learning a lot, but I'm running a marketing campaign in Wichita, Kansas. What can you tell me about my market? And the answer was, I can't tell you anything because nobody's ever paid me to go do surveys in Wichita or the other, thousands and thousands of locations across the country. So to answer that, we've developed and helped pioneer this new technique. It's a statistical analysis technique, but basically allows us to estimate with very high accuracy. I mean like 98% accuracy. public opinion for all 50 states, all 435 congressional districts, the 1,000 largest cities, 3,000 plus counties. We've actually pushed this technique all the way down to the census tract level, which is essentially the neighborhood scale. Okay? So let me give you a sense of what that means. This is an interactive tool. It's actually reasonably, if you're a little data inclined, it's fun to interact with. It's available on our website, so I encourage you to go check it out. But here's a national number. I just showed that to you. 65% of Americans are worried about climate change. Okay, fine. What about where I live? Well, here's how it looks at the county level, and you can immediately see there's actually a lot of variation around the country. So one of my favorite places to, well, darker red, more worried, a higher population is worried. In the darker blue, less than 50% are worried. And one of my favorites is Texas. In many people's minds, Texas stereotypically very conservative, Republican, oil patch state, long led by climate-denying governors, currently led by one. Seems like the last place you could have a constructive conversation about climate change. Not true. Those counties right there along the border are actually more worried about climate change than most of the counties in liberal California. Why? Latinos. And in fact, that aligns with a lot of our in-depth work with that particular community, where we found for over a decade that contrary to common wisdom, which many people assume that climate change is an issue that only white, well-educated, latte-sipping liberals care about, it's not true. Okay? It's actually the Latino community who's more engaged with this issue than any other. They're more convinced it's real, that it's human caused, they're more worried about it, they're more supportive of climate action, they're more willing to get personally involved. Okay? And they turn out to be one of the fastest growing demographics in this country. They also happen to be a potentially vitally powerful political force because they often are found in swing states. Okay? But they don't tend to vote at the same rate as white Americans. So there's an enormous potential, not just political force there, but economic force there. Now, just to say this in another point in the same way, here we've asked Americans, do you think global warming will harm plants and animals? And you find that a majority of Americans in every single county in America, including oil patch, North Dakota, Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, etc., a majority of Americans say, yeah, it'll harm plants and animals. How about people in the United States? Not quite so much. How about you personally? Though again, note that the yellow up here is predominantly Latino areas, African American areas, and Native American areas. Okay. The other thing I want to quickly introduce you to is another innovation called Global Warming 6 Americas. And here we basically learned a very long time ago that Americans do not have a single viewpoint about climate change or any important issue. And then the world tends to divide people into believers and deniers. And that's way too simplistic and really not very helpful. And one of the first cardinal rules of effective communication is know your audience. Who are they? Where do they come from? What do they know? What do they misunderstand? What do they value? Who do they trust? It's only once you know who they are that you as a communicator can go more than halfway to meet them where they are, to help them in their learning journey, not yours. I just said that so simply, and it's so profoundly important because we all get this wrong. And let me just use an extreme example. I've been steeped in climate science for 30 years. I would love to have a nice long conversation about the role of clouds in climate models with you all. You don't want that conversation. So, all right, sorry. So that's my point. How do you figure out what they are ready to talk about, what matters to them, not what matters to you? And how do you stand there on that path with them and help, maybe even hold their hand and take that first timid step towards taking this issue more seriously? That's your job as a communicator. So anyway, to help with that, we've identified what we call 6 Americas, 6 different distinct audiences that each come at this issue from a very different starting point. The first is a group we call the alarmed. These are people who are fully convinced climate change is happening, it's human caused, it's urgent. They strongly support action, but the big question in their minds is, what can I do? We've done a good job communicating the problem, but they don't know what to do. They don't know what they can do as individuals, what we can do as communities, what we can do as a nation or the world. And they're really hungry to know about those solutions. The next group we call the concerned. Also happening, it's human caused, it's serious, but they still tend to think of it as distant in time and space. So they're paying attention, they kind of support action, but they don't yet understand why it's urgent. The cautious, in the middle, still on the fence. Is it real? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? Paying attention, but still kind of confused. The disengaged, a small but important group, I think, that basically say, I've never heard the term global warming before. Okay. I've never seen it in the media I pay attention to, or the people I talk to. That just doesn't show up. Okay. The doubtful, these are people who think, I don't think it's real, but if it is, it's natural. Natural cycles, nothing we have anything to do with, nothing I need to worry about. And then last but not least, the dismissive, who are firmly convinced this is not happening, it's not human caused, it's not a serious problem, and who quite literally tell us they're conspiracy theorists. They say it's a hoax, it's scientists making up data, it's a UN plot to take away our sovereignty, it's a get-rich scheme by Al Gore and his friends. Evidently, you're all Al Gore's friends. And other such conspiracy-type narratives. Okay? Now, vitally importantly, they're really small. This is from 2020. Our most recent data is not too much difference, about 9 or 10%. It usually hovers right around there. They're only 9 or 10%. They're only 9 or 10%. But they're a really loud 9 or 10%. They're really vocal 9 or 10%. They're more than adequately represented in the halls of Congress. And they've tended to dominate the public square to such an extent that most of us assume that they are half or more of the country. And climate change has joined sex, religion, and politics as topics you don't talk about at the Thanksgiving Day table because you don't want to piss off Uncle Bob. It's often an Uncle Bob. But that's because they've essentially bullied the rest of us into what we've identified as climate silence. People actually want to talk about climate change. The other 91% of us are actually willing to have a constructive conversation about climate change. But most of us are afraid to talk about it because we're afraid that the other person might attack us because we think that they're everywhere, but they're not. So let's come back to corporations and industry. You can think of that Six Americas model, by the way. This is essentially its market segmentation. Okay? Same basic approach that any company would take to market segmentation, we're just applying it to an issue. And it turns out that it's very helpful in helping us see who in particular, which of these audiences is most engageable, right? Who would your prime prospects be from a business standpoint? Do you think corporations and industry should be doing more or less to address global warming? You see that almost unanimously the alarmed say yes. Also, most of the concerned, and then it steps down quite a bit when you get to the other groups. Over the next 12 months, do you intend to buy the products of companies that are taking steps to reduce global warming? And here I'm showing you the more frequently answers. Again, a very clear stair step. It's the alarmed who are the most interested and willing to do so. And that's roughly about just over a quarter of the American public, which is an enormous market. That's a massively big number of people. Over the next 12 months, would you like to punish companies that are opposing steps to reduce global warming by not buying their products? Same basic response. But interestingly, when we ask, why don't you do it? Because most people tell you they're not actually doing it yet. Why not? Is it too costly? Is it inconvenient? The products aren't as good? No. Over and over again, we see the number one answer is simply, I don't know which companies to reward or punish. Now, that's big. That's a communications opportunity. Okay? If you're a business executive, and I do not claim to walk in the moccasins of a business executive, so there's lots goes on in their decisions. But I look at that and I either start to salivate or my knees start to quiver. Because depending on where you are on this question, compared to your peers in your community or your fellow competitors, you're either in a position that this is a market advantage or you're at a disadvantage. Okay? But consumers just don't know who's good and who's bad. So they're looking for that information, and we have not done a good job of helping to distinguish good product, good company, bad company. Okay? And of course, that's a dynamic and constantly changing thing because of innovation. And things like people adopting all kinds of new policies and practices. So just to say, there's a lot here, and I think it's a big opportunity for environmental groups. This is something where I think environmentalists have a lot of credibility with the American people, is to call out, to name, blame, and shame particular actors. I think they have a lot of credibility for that. But if I was a company, who I'd really be most afraid of is my competitors, because they have the money and the motivation to try to distinguish their products from mine. And then just to come back to the Six Americas for a quick second is to say, we're tracking how these change over time. So again, think of these as market segments. That alarm segment has grown quite dramatically over the past 10 years. And really importantly, in 2012, the alarmed and the dismissive were essentially tied at 10 to 12%. So for every one alarmed, there was one dismissive in this country. Okay, these are the two groups that are the most engaged, the most politically active, the loudest. But by 2022, the alarmed had grown to 26%, whereas the dismissive were still at about 11%. So we're nearing 2.5 to nearly 3 alarmed for every 1 dismissive, which again reflects an underlying shift in this underlying social, cultural, and political climate of climate change, which I think goes a long way to helping us understand why things like the Inflation Reduction Act got passed this time, whereas cap and trade did not get passed 10 years ago. The conditions are different. And then we can have a long conversation about that within the political parties. And then just very quickly, we look at this across all the other countries of the world, and this is just a subsample from a couple of years ago. But really, the point I want you to understand is, if you can see in bold, is the United States right between Malaysia and Nigeria. So this is really a uniquely American thing, and we're still struggling with organized climate denial. Most of the rest of the world, and again, in particular, notice that Costa Rica, Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, etc., Central and South American countries, as a bloc, are also much more concerned about climate change than elsewhere around the world. Same pattern we see within the United States, we see globally. So my larger point is that that alarm segment, that most willing to spend money to be part of climate solutions, is massive, especially when you look globally. So just to summarize, just like consumer market segments, there are different consumer segments on the issue of climate change that need tailored engagement and marketing strategies. Many Americans are willing to express their concerns about climate change through consumer activism, but they just don't know what to do. And many consumers are even more alarmed and concerned about climate change in the US, but they are looking for company leadership and, most importantly, products and services that empower them to take climate action. And this is also something I see a lot of companies making mistakes about. They tout, hey, we put solar panels on the roof of our manufacturing facility, or we're buying 100% clean energy. And that's all good. Like, consumers approve of that. But what they really want is they want you as a company to empower me to be part of the solution. Okay? You get very little credit for putting solar panels on your roof by comparison that you gave me a car that's more fuel efficient. Okay. All right, and if you're interested in learning more about any of these things, this is just a tiny smidgen of the work we've done. Please come visit our website, where all of these are freely available to you all. And so just to quickly finally conclude, mitigating, preparing for, and adapting to climate change is going to require not just smart policy and economics and technological innovation. We need all of those, but also different decisions and behaviors by 8 to 10 billion human beings. We are all responsible to communicate with, engage, and empower our friends, our families, our fellow citizens, and our leaders to build public demand and political will for climate action. So thank you very much, and look forward to questions. You first out of the box.
Hi, thank you. This was incredibly interesting. I wonder how the numbers differ when you look at age distribution.
Great question. So if anyone who didn't hear us, how do the numbers vary by age? The question we've been tracking for many years. And for many years, there were no generational differences. Okay? Despite what people think. Because again, you're making decisions, you're evaluating youth based on what you read about or see youth doing through the media. Okay? Or if you're at a university, what they're showing up at your door rather than the case. But that's not a good measure of millions of people. And so what we basically found here in the United States, and let me use the US as an example. In the US, we find very interesting that young Democrats have essentially the same views as their parents and their grandparents. There are not real differences among Democrats. But when you look among Republicans, young Republicans are much more engaged with this issue than their parents, and especially their grandparents.
So that's where the hope comes in.
There are lots of places of hope. I would say that is one of the places of hope, but it's a long-term hope. So it's not what we need in the next 10 years. Yeah.
Tony, thanks. This is tremendous. Given all your extensive experience researching, better understanding, and explaining these issues, how do you feel about the phrase climate change or the phrase global warming? Climate change as opposed to climate crisis, climate emergency, global warming compared to maybe global extinction. I mean, in terms of, are those self-limiting in ways that we need to better understand and fight back against?
So this is there's a big question, which I'm not going to do justice to. But we actually did a whole study a few years ago looking at the difference between the term climate change and global warming. And what we found is that Americans believe global warming is happening, are more likely to say global warming is happening, they're more likely to say global warming is human caused, they're more worried about global warming, they're more supportive of action on global warming, they're more willing to get personally involved around global warming, and that's particularly true among people of color. Okay, so one is, and this is a much larger conversation about discourse and language and the power of words and so on, but context. Okay. So like, I have lots of friends who've like tried to push the word global weirding as an example. You know, if you got an hour-long opportunity in front of an audience, I mean, you heard me actually going back and forth between climate change and global warming because you all knew what I was talking about. But if you've got a 30-second hit on NBC and you come in there and say, I'm going to talk about global weirding, yeah, that's weirding all right. They don't know what the hell you're talking about. Okay? So I like to say those other, for better or for worse, the fundamental terms that most people came to develop any kind of an understanding about, what's the word, the grain of sand that became the pearl of their understanding of global warming, was the term global warming, and then secondarily climate change. So if you're just trying to get them to understand what the heck you're talking about, absolutely use those terms. And then I like to think of crisis and global heating and global weirding as that's seasoning. Like, once you've established what we're talking about, okay, throw in a little global weirding, a little climate crisis, just to kind of make your broader point.
Thank you.
But context. Yes.
Hi, Austin. We weren't doing company names, okay. So I'm wondering, as far as products, when it comes to consumers, what they're choosing to buy.
Yeah.
There's a lot of companies that will offer the option to like offset their purchase or take care of that amount of it. At my company, we've realized that people don't like to purchase these things that much. Have you done any work to see what their preferences
We've done
are?
some, and we're actually getting ready to do some at the global scale, so
Okay.
we'll have more information,
Cool.
or better answer to
Check
that
back.
later. I would say, look, the fundamentals, people, they don't know what a carbon offset is.
Okay.
They don't know what carbon is. They don't know what an offset is. And by the way, net zero, what? Okay, so like we all live inside the green bubble, inside a green bubble, inside a green bubble, inside a green bubble. Like our language, our discourse is so at a remove from the normal human being, like no one here is normal. You have all kinds of words in your head that nobody else on the planet has. And yet we forget that. We call this the veil of knowledge. Not the veil of ignorance, the veil of knowledge. That once you've learned something, we all kind of just assume that everybody else around us knows it too. And they don't. Okay? So one, I think the understanding of what an offset is super thin. And then the fact is that the communication or the discourse around offsets have actually been pretty tough. And I think that well done offsets with proper gold standard verification and so on should be part of the solution. I personally think it's possible for them to play a role. But let's just face it, the media environment has been brutal to carbon offsets in recent years because we found that a number of them are just smoke and mirrors.
2-point communications.
Let me actually quote one of my dear friends who's one of the top crisis communicators in Canada, and he advises a lot of companies. He says there's 3 basic rules. 1, do the right thing. 2, be seen doing the right thing. And 3, don't get the order of those mixed up. Yes, sir.
Great presentation, thank you. How do you explain Costa Rica's position on top of that chart? Is there any particular attributes to that?
Costa Rica's just rules. It's just great. I don't know if you spend any time in Costa Rica. I highly recommend it. It's just a wonderful, wonderful place. I think it's really part of a much larger conversation because what we see in Costa Rica is just a reflection of what we see in every single country across Central and South America. And as I was saying, also we find among Latinos here in the U.S. It's a complex answer, and I don't feel like we have a full understanding of it yet. But what it really seems to be driven by, to simplify, is culture. Is that this is just deeply embedded in not just kind of abstract culture, but familial culture. People, as families, go into natural environments to be with each other as well as with the natural environment, which is a very different cultural understanding of nature compared to kind of the prototypical white male experience of nature as kind of reflected in Henry David Thoreau, right? You go alone into the wilderness to, be amazed by the glories of nature and God and so on. Like, there's a huge, powerful American discourse, which is a really individualistic kind of perspective. And so I think that's really one of the key things that we're seeing there is that it's much more about community as well as deeply experiential in these communities. But it's only a partial answer. Let's see. Actually, let's go here. Yes.
Hi, great presentation. So much data, so thank you for that. I have a question. It's kind of like chicken and egg. Which one is first? Yeah. From what I listened to you say, that in the U.S., the perceived responsibility, the first is the corporation, second, people point to themselves, and third is the government. However, the order is different in China.
Yes.
So who is the true responsible party here? Is there data? And like, how can you make the most impact by finding out what the true root cause is to, make the most impact there?
Oh my goodness. That's a different question. I think you will find a lot of different answers to that question. I personally tend to think of these as deeply embedded and interpenetrating systems. Like, governments are crucial. They set the basic rules of the road within which all citizens and companies operate. Like, they can require all kinds of things, including that you can no longer pollute, or that we put a price on carbon, or that we invest in clean tech. I mean, obviously government plays a critical role. But companies are the ones that are actually innovating all these solutions and getting them out at mass scale to all those consumers I was just talking about who actually have to then choose to buy them, right? So I personally, I don't like saying one is more important than the other. I think they're all important. Some are more important at a given moment. This is a Gordian knot, and it's evolving and rolling downhill all together at once. Perfect.
Tony, I think we have time for one more.
Okay. Who wants it?
Quick question about consumer activism.
Yeah.
On the previous slide, you were talking about how consumers don't yet know which companies to punish. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on what solutions you see for that. Of course, we've seen like ESGs, but those have their
Massively big question. So you're saying, what could we be doing to help consumers make better choices, essentially? I'm going to give you a really deeper response to that. And this is a personal example. When I first got into this business 35 years ago, I naively thought that what we needed to do was to teach people to think and to activate their environmental values and to get them to make conscious, deliberate decisions. So essentially, you go into the grocery store, you see the 10 different products that are all essentially the same, and you're comparing price and brand and quality and, environment. And like the equivalent of a green eye shade comes down, you're like, okay, that one's better for the environment, I will buy that. Okay? Having studied human psychology and decision making for 30 years, I realized that's exactly what we don't want. Then, we want to think as little as possible. This is an incredibly energy-intensive thing, and you really want to dedicate it to the things that you care about, which may be the royal family or what's going on in your phone, not is this tube of toothpaste better than that toothpaste on the environment. And so really the deep answer to this is that Right now, we inhabit a system where the default choice is unsustainable. You have to make a conscious, deliberate decision, and you have to be motivated to go a little out of your way to select the greener product. Okay? I want that to be inverted. I want the automatic choice, the default choice, to be a sustainable product. And if you want the gas guzzling car, it's still there, but you now got to go out of your way to buy that. That's my fantasy. Okay? Is that we have built a system that makes it easy for us. I don't want to think about climate change with every single purchase I make. Right? I just want to do the right thing. And I think we all are like that because we've got other things in our lives we want to focus our attention on. And that's the most scarce resource on the planet. It's your attention. So I'll just leave that there.
Tony will be here. We'll be outside. If you have more questions, comments, concerns, please direct them that way. Go forth and talk to somebody about climate change in your network outside of this room as your one assignment after this. So, yeah, we have people coming in.
First off, it's stabbed yeah. You gotta like every early stage justify that. So you're making but my question is really about understanding, I guess, because most people don't understand
back on the 20th. But that is yes, I don't have a point to say anything, but I know I'm going to be that's not going
I'm always going to be responsive to me. It's hard to say.
that is going to shift.